Welcome to the Awkward Conversations podcast. Today's episode is Tony Gallagher. Tony is one of the prominent academics in Queen's who specialises in education and social sciences, and is like today's episode. I felt like I was sitting at the feet of the master. Like his takes on things were nuanced, detailed, interesting, and yeah, he covered a wide range of topics.
For example, he talked us through the decline of the SDLP in the post-John Hume era. He talked us through some of his views on the socio-economic inequalities in the North, and he had some very interesting statistics to talk about, and how religion makes the headline, but in fact there's some big class issues at play in the North. And his political analysis is very interesting and worth a listen to on a range of different topics, from the US election through to the most recent election here.
Tony Gallagher, thanks very much for coming on the podcast. Yeah, it's good to have you.
I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, I think on the run-up to the election, there was lots of, I guess, wrangling when it comes to protocol and where the different parties stand and if they took a strong enough stance. What was your take on it all, and how do you think things are going to play out now after today's visit from our great leader?
Well, the wrangling has continued, and obviously we haven't got off first base in terms of actually having a post-election sort of situation, as where I was a bit surprised whenever the DUP decided they weren't going to support the election of the speaker, because I thought they were going to be satisfied with not having the executive working, but allow the MLAs to meet and to hold this sort of the shadow executive, as it were, to account, and at least give all of their elected members a bit of a platform. So I was a bit surprised when that happened. It's quite high stakes. It's quite a high stakes game that's been played here. And the events of the last couple of days have just raised those stakes even higher. At this stage, I think it's very difficult to predict exactly what's going to happen. At one extreme, whenever the UK government publishes whatever its proposals are around the protocol, and if it starts doing something quite quickly, maybe the DUP will go back in to the Assembly reasonably quickly. That's one possibility. Maybe unlikely for that to happen very quickly. In the immediate aftermath of what was happening, there was a lot of speculation that this would run for 6 months without any real movement, and we would be facing another election, possibly with the DUP thinking that if there's another election, if they had played hardball and showed that they were playing hardball around the protocol, that they might pull back some of the TUV votes and maybe might change the situation with regard to Sinn Féin in terms of being the largest party, which would have made it a different calculation for them in relation to go back into Assembly. So those are the two sort of extremes, I guess, of what could happen. And to be perfectly honest, I think it's anybody's guess where things are going to go forward.
You said, Tony, that you were surprised that they didn't elect a speaker, but I wasn't that surprised. Yeah. And so far as this being their strategy, or what I perceive to be their strategy, whereas next week they could go for the election of a speaker and say, we've had a wee bit of something, so We'll give you a little bit of something, because it was a very binary situation they're in. Allow their MLAs to be put forward and nominated for positions and that or not, it's very binary, it's all or nothing there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not, we don't know at this stage, and we'll never know just the extent of which there had been quiet conversations going on in the background. So in these sorts of situations, we don't know the full information that everyone who's involved in playing this game, what information they have. And it's possible that they've got some sort of an inkling that the UK government's going to do something which encourages them to hold back in order to claim a success. That's, you could well be right.
Yeah. And also you were talking about the election in 6 months. Now, by my mathematics, with DUP on 21 12.9, I think, and TUV on 7.8. That just about reaches the 29% that Sinn Féin got. So assuming that they're banking on almost unilaterally taking all those votes from TUV through their strategy in the next 6 months, even if they did manage to do that, they're just about pulling up level. And then they're also reckoning that they'll get some sort of reward from the electorate over, what they may or may not do, or whatever their strategy may or may not be over the 6 months. So that's a bit of a gamble,
Well, absolutely. But I mean, we're in a situation where everyone is making some sort of a gamble and rolling the dice a little bit as what's going to happen next. I mean, if we did get to the point where there's another election, I wouldn't be surprised that one of the key messages from the DUP will be that we've been putting on the pressure, we're getting things moving, we've shown that we're solid in this, so, and try and pull back not just TV, but possibly to pull back some UUP votes. The old argument about we've got to be the largest party. I have no doubt as well that Sinn Féin would be trying to put the squeeze on the SDLP vote even more in that situation, and you could have a further exaggeration of what seemed to have happened this time whenever you had that sort of consolidation of the votes around those parties. So that could be the nature of the next election, with Alliance in the middle trying to say, well, if everyone votes for us, then that will maybe give an entirely different dynamic to things and change the direction of political discourse altogether. Who knows? We're in a very unusual situation. I mean, if you look at assembly elections since the devolution, the one big change happened in 2003 whenever prior to that we had the SDLP and UUP basically running the executive. After 2003 that flipped and it never changed. This last election has changed things, and it's not entirely clear just what the full implications of that change are going to be. This is one of those unusual situations whenever the election does actually make a difference. A real difference.
What did you make of the reason? What was your estimation of the reasons behind SDLP getting squeezed and Sinn Féin's vote growing?
Well, I mean, if you look at the SDLP vote over the lifetime of all of the assembly elections, it has been going steadily downwards. And that's a fairly consistent pattern. In this particular instance, I do think the message about the possibility of the Nationalist Party being the largest party played very powerfully with a lot of people. And a lot of people who in other circumstances might have voted SDLP decided this time to support Sinn Féin. There was all that chat after the election about lending votes. I think that's sort of a false hope. Once you vote for a different party, there's a fair chance you're going to keep voting for them. So I think the SDLP has some work to do to try to figure out how they're going to put themselves back in the frame. But I think that did play a role because this was the first 100 years after Northern Ireland was formed. This was the first time that there was a real possibility that a nationalist party could emerge as the largest party in an elected assembly in Northern Ireland. That's exactly what happened.
Yeah, me and Damien have talked a lot about the SDLP, and I have pointed out to Damien that, in my opinion, from political parties of all countries, and looking at how bad the Lib Dems in England were in 2015, etc., just trying to look for comparison about how badly your fortunes can go downhill,
Sure.
And I've talked about the SDLP, and at every turn where an election has happened and they've looked at, right, what do we have to do now, they slow the decline, they seem to have took the wrong turn at every single point, be it the Fianna Fáil partnership. I mean, telling yourself to a party whose fortunes in the south have just been going through the floor, I think they're on they're running at what, 17, 18, 19% in the polls in the south, a deeply unpopular leader. They had Margaret Ritchie for some bizarre reason, thinking that taking up a position in the House of Lords wouldn't detract from her party back home. what else have we got, Damien? I think of, geez, I think of
they dared to criticize Sinn Féin as well. That was a big one of yours that you're outraged about.
Not specifically. I mean, they ran the Westminster. They normally do a bit better, especially in Derry and historically in say places like South Down. But they campaigned on stopping Brexit, but obviously that's not going to happen with 2 MPs in a parliament of 650. It just doesn't work. Nationalists have known that for hundreds of years, not just in the past couple of elections.
Well, I'm not sure, but I think the 2 MPs.
You think there's some merits?
I think the 2 MPs are making an impact. In Westminster, so I wouldn't sort of write that out completely. I mean, I think the problem for the SDLP is it's always been a coalition. Covering a range of different positions, from some of their elected members who were quite conservative Catholics, who on the other hand you have a very strong sort of social democratic stroke Labour group in it as well, and trying to give themselves a distinctive identity has always been a challenge. To the extent that they sort of highlight their sort of nationalist credentials, then they're always going to look a little less nationalist than Sinn Féin, especially, to be honest, the further the distance we put between the time of the political violence. And so that's always going to finding an identity for themselves has always been a problem.
Is the Labour bit gone, Tony?
Well, no, I think there's, part of that social democratic tradition within the SDLP has looked to the Labour Party in the South as a possible partner. What they don't have, which Labour parties in all democratic countries, which they don't have, is strong connections with the trade unions. So that makes the Labour credentials look a little bit weak. But whenever the SDLP was set up, it was set up as a coalition between a whole range of different people, and it has kept that coalition character for a long time. But maybe this is the point whenever they have to start thinking about offering something distinctive and different to the electorate. It's a real challenge for them, and it's by no means clear that they're going to be able to survive all of this. I don't think it is a real challenge.
No, and it wouldn't be the first time a party's kind of fallen between a few bar stools. Looking at like the PDs in the South had a fairly strong vote 20 years ago, and they just kind of petered in the obscurity. It's intense. Even Labour in the South has kind of petered in they were on the brink of obscurity there.
Well, absolutely.
They changed leader, but it doesn't take an awfully long time for that to happen. It seems a couple of election cycles.
Yeah, once you fall out of the public light, and you start not being heard so much, then very quickly there's a risk that you just fade away. That said, the Liberal Party in England at one stage was reduced to a tiny number of MPs. I remember back whenever I was younger, there was a handful of them, and then they came roaring back at a later stage. PR elections do provide a little bit more of a cushion, because you can get win seats even if your support is not particularly huge. But I think this, one of the things that's come out with the two main pressures that have come out of this, or the trends that have come out of this election, is the movement, the consolidation of votes within both communities towards Sinn Féin, and to an extent the DUP stroke TUV type of tendency, and then the growth of Alliance becoming the clear party in the centre ground for the moment. And those that if you like, trifurcation of politics in Northern Ireland is one of the key things that's come out of this. That would create an interesting new dynamic if there ever is to be an executive, where if we take into account First Minister and Deputy First Minister, there will be four nationalists, 4 unionists, and 2 Alliance. How that all is going to work will be really interesting to see.
Yeah, definitely.
What we've known in the past in previous executives is that, in some senses, the 2 larger parties have conducted the business themselves and then brought it to the executive. With Alliance, there's 2 people. They may not be what to go along with that, because they'll be the sort of potentially squeezed in the middle. At the same time, the relationship between Sinn Féin and the DUP, I think, is going to be, I would expect it's going to be a lot harder if they do get into an executive just in the current environment.
Do you think that the environment from the 2017 election to this election the environment's changed a lot. It's become a lot. It seems to have become a lot angrier for loyalists. Take for example last April. The only reason loyalist protests / riots ended was the death of Prince Philip. I think that really put a break in it, but it was kind of picking up a lot of steam at that point. It didn't really happen throughout the summer months, but then Jeffrey was indicating that's pulling out of the executive was a possibility, and that there kind of took the steam out of that train. But do you think that loyalists or loyalism has become angrier in the past few years, and is the anger caused by leaders of unionism?
Well, if you look at sort of events over the years through the Troubles and afterwards, there's often been a sort of a sense that whenever major new changes are put on the agenda, these are sometimes seen by some sections of loyalism as existential threats, and that makes them it enhances a sense of fear. In many cases, like we think of some of the events at the start of the Troubles, the Anglo-Irish Agreement, even in some sense the Good Friday Agreement, a lot of these things turned out not to be existential threats, but that didn't prevent the same sense of sort of a sense of imminent disaster in a later big event. What's different this time is that demographics are changing, and I think part of the fear that's driving all of this is a fear that we're getting, from a loyalist point of view, dangerously close to a united Ireland, and I think that's what's driving a lot of this. Now, you can argue about whether the opinion poll evidence suggests that we are actually that close or not, but I think that that perception is driving a lot of this. This is the thing about the protocol. From an economic point of view, broadly speaking, the protocol makes an awful lot of sense and puts Northern Ireland potentially in a very advantageous position. But the symbolic loosening of the connection between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, for some people, for perhaps many people, is raising a significant sense of threat that there is an agenda to slowly decouple Northern Ireland from the rest from GB, and push it towards United Ireland. And in that situation, this fear of an existential threat emerges again, and helps to, I think, motivate people to act in some cases in the way they have been acting.
You think post Good Friday Agreement, there was a lot of unease within unionism, and that flag protests were significant for the unionists, but were perhaps the significance of it was felt to a more extreme degree because there was already a high level of anxiety around the post-agreement life. Do you think, or is that, do you think the two of them are too far apart to have significance with each other?
Yeah, well, there's two possibilities here. One is that it reflected a genuine sense of fear that things were changing in a way which for part of the community was viewed as not good, and they were trying to hold the line on certain things because they saw the line being pushed back. The other sort of tendency here is that some people were trying to manipulate these fears in order to achieve political ends. Oftentimes, particularly in divided society, just combinations of both of those things. There are genuine fears on the part of a lot of people, but they can be manipulated and can be used by others to try and achieve political ends. So, working out what exactly was going on is it the task of history, I guess. But both of these things, I think, were happening. And so, yeah, I think in the aftermath of that, there was a perception by some that if agreement had been found, there must be something behind it. This is one of our problems in Northern Ireland. People are always looking for the hidden agenda. They always assume that no matter what people what reason people give for doing something. There's something else behind it, and the hidden agenda usually is taken as something really bad or potentially very, very bad, and so people react against it. But then that just creates this a countervailing sense of fear in other people. It's one of the challenges of divided society, trying to find a way through those tendencies.
Like, talking about a United Ireland, obviously, would be like earth-shattering to many unionists because of the huge impact on their identity. And I was actually talking to Mick Fealty on this kind of Twitter live event run by the DUP leader guy on that Twitter handle. And Mick Fealty was talking about you probably know more about this than I do, the Overton window. I don't know if you've heard of that. So it's something to do where it's like a window of time, and I'm going to absolutely butcher this, but there's a window of time in which people can come to grips with a new thing, and if you don't if you don't come to grips with it within the certain time frame of that window, then the thing will collapse in on itself, essentially. And his kind of theory was that
I've seen a couple of variations of that, Damien, and some of it says if you want something moderate, then you start talking about something radical. And if you start talking about something radical and a few people join you and talking about it, about this radical idea, either for or against, it therefore then makes the kind of moderate thing that you were kind of reaching for seem pretty acceptable at that point. And then at that point, you can then talk about something else that seems like a radical idea at the time, and then everyone starts talking about the radical idea for and against, and therefore the less radical thing that you're looking to achieve seems a bit more palatable, and then you progress incrementally that way,
yeah.
And I've seen it work like that, but here I don't think the same rules apply.
Well, I think one of the issues that I suspect a lot of loyalists have around a lot of the conversation around United Ireland is that it's just a conversation around United Ireland, rather than a conversation around the range of options, including a different type of Northern Ireland, where it's like people don't want to. Some people don't want to get involved in a conversation where the terms of reference already set the general pattern of the outcome in place whenever they're not particularly inclined towards the outcome. And I think that's one of the things here, and the it's the majority community that's gradually changing, where there's a perception of a sense of loss over an extended period of time. That continues to be, I think, a factor in some of the way people are acting and reacting.
Do you think? Sorry, go ahead,
Damien.
Kieran.
I was just about to say that, Tony. I've noticed that myself, and some people would prefer to shut their eyes and ears to that, by basically, as you were saying, if you've set out the kind of parameters of what you're looking to talk about, then, and you don't like the look of it, then don't engage. If you were advising unionist leaders or people or figures within unionism, what advice would you give them? Engage with it, don't engage with it, engage and get stuck in, and then try and move the parameters?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not sure that they're terribly keen to get involved in a conversation around what a United Ireland might look like. What they maybe should be doing is trying to articulate what Northern Ireland could be like, to make it a place that majority of people are happy to stay within that arrangement, or some other sort of arrangement between Ireland and the UK, where Northern Ireland sits within that. And they're articulating a clear case for the union is difficult if you assume that everything's fine. Because if you assume that everything's fine, then there's no need to suggest anything different that needs to be done in order to satisfy people. That's part of the challenge, I guess. But that would be the advice. If you want to head off a conversation around United Ireland, then provide a better alternative, and a better alternative in the context of Northern Ireland could be anything between sort of a clearly sort of equal, just, rights-based society, or some sort of arrangement between the UK and the Republic that puts Northern Ireland in a special sort of a place, a bit like a permanent Good Friday Agreement structure, regardless of where the first port of call is. If any issues come up, at the moment the first port of call is London, but Dublin is the second port of call. It's conceivable at some point in the future Dublin could be the first port of call, but London's still the second port of call. The problem in Northern Ireland always was a majority-minority situation, and the fact that the minority faced a degree of discrimination and prejudice. If there was United Ireland, then you still have a majority-minority problem. Just the parameters have changed, and that's part of this dynamic.
So the onus would really be on them. And when you're talking about the majority-minority dynamic, is they have as much protective legislation as possible. The protective legislation which was absent for 75 years in the north.
Well, yeah, I mean, but it's this is illustrated very well in the whole sort of shenanigans around the protocol. That those sorts of issues can be approached through dialogue if there is a reasonable degree of trust on all sides. And when that's absent, it becomes very difficult for people to have real dialogue, partly because it goes back to this earlier point about hidden agendas. So if you're sort of engaging with someone you think is a threat to you, they may say fine words, but you may not believe that they mean them. And so how do you build relationships of trust as a way of having genuine dialogue where you can actually explore this as a problem in which it is in everyone's interest to try to solve, and in which everyone is prepared to engage in some degree of give and take in order to find a solution that works for as many people as possible.
That's a good point, Tony. I was just thinking there earlier on, when I was looking at some of the stuff you've done, and I seen that you worked with Ian Shuttleworth, and Ian Shuttleworth taught me for a few areas back in 2008 about labour markets. That man really loves the labour markets, and really
he loves data and analysing data. Yeah,
he loves looking at census data.
Yeah,
and industrial decline and the north of England and brass bands, etc. and dinosaur t-shirts, and I thought to myself, he always talked about labour market trends and disadvantage in society. And one of the things that he didn't talk about much back then was the white Protestant disadvantage in education in the labour market here, which now has pretty much been something that's been identified in the past decade or a bit more. Why is it then that the white Protestant male has become like a maligned population?
I mean, I think there's a number of different things that are coming together here, and I think this discourse is a little bit overly simplified as well, to be honest. There was a point at which the average levels of performance of school leavers from Catholic schools was lower than leavers from controlled or Protestant schools, and this became an issue with SACR, the Stanton Advisory Commission on Human Rights, which was the precursor to the Human Rights Commission, because they saw a link between these educational outputs and labour market opportunity in a context where there was a government commitment to equality of opportunity. We're talking about the 1980s here. So they commissioned some work. I was involved in it with a few colleagues looking at some of these issues around education. And one of the things that eventually led to was the equalisation of funding for Catholic schools. That was quite an important step towards a commitment to equal opportunity. What followed from that was a sort of clear pattern where it switched in terms of the sort of performance levels from schools. So if you look at the average performance levels at the moment, they tend to be a bit lower among working class Protestant boys compared to other groups. That said, the biggest achievement gap in education in Northern Ireland at the moment is between kids from affluent and kids from non-affluent backgrounds. And that's exacerbated by the system of academic selection. So the focus on sort of religious differences, where if you look at in overall terms, the achievement gap in terms of religion is around about 4%. If you look at the achievement gap between kids from affluent or non or disadvantaged backgrounds, it's probably closer to about 30% and higher again if you look at the gap between secondary schools. So that discourse, like, there's something to it, but actually this is an issue of disadvantage and the way in which that we're not really dealing with that problem seriously enough.
Yeah, so if you assume then, Tony, that the quality and the pedagogy and schools and maintained schools and Catholic schools is pretty much of a standard, and what you're saying is you've got your middle class student faring much better, then is that pointing towards the problem existing outside the school rather than within the school? The experience of children and affluent communities is there's a fundamental difference there that's leading the difference in outcomes and their late teens.
Yeah, well, it may sound counterintuitive, but no educational problem can be solved by education alone. This is one of the whole point about the notion of joined up government. The single biggest measure we could do to try and address some of the issues of educational inequality in Northern Ireland would be to have an effective anti-poverty strategy. Because that has a big impact on educational outcomes. The issues that we're talking about, there's a lot that education can and should be doing, and we know from the First Start report there's some measures have been identified. I think there's more needs to be done than was in that report, but there's certainly a good strategy there. But there's a lot of other things that need to be done to address some of the economic inequalities that exist in our society, because they have a pervasive effect on educational outcomes. Even we saw this during the COVID crisis. Access to a decent meal every day was really important. I think we're in a world now where we live in a digital world. The digital economy is really, really strong. We've taken it for granted for years that every household in Northern Ireland should have access to clean water and electricity. It's just inconceivable that people wouldn't be in that situation. Maybe we need to start working towards the assumption that every household has access to the internet, because it plays such an important part in everyday life. And that became clear in COVID, because lots of kids from more disadvantaged households didn't have access to online support the way other kids did. So there's lots of things that in education that can be addressed by the Department of Education, by schools and by teachers and all the rest of us. But the only way that these problems will be really solved is if the executive or the different departments of government and others work together collectively to try to solve these issues. Otherwise, we're just continually putting out fires. The educational inequality and its link to economic inequalities has always been a big issue in Northern Ireland, and I think in recent years the focus on religious differences in employment have helped to obscure that much more significant issue. The COVID crisis simply underlined that, because the challenges that existed were exacerbated in a very significant way during COVID, and that's why I think all this chat about.
It's ironic there, Tony, that 4 months before the pandemic started, Jeremy Corbyn advocated free broadband for all.
Well, that's true, yeah. But he also
was destroyed for it.
But he also advocated half a dozen or more other sort of huge sweeping changes. And because there was so many of these things, the platform looked not credible to the electorate, and that's why he did so badly. If they had focused on a smaller number of things, then maybe it would have got through. But if you put a whole lot of things into a basket and say you'll do them all, people won't believe you, won't believe that it's possible.
Well, as I said to Damien, Jeremy Corbyn's always had the best ideas, but the worst thing about Jeremy Corbyn is he never knew how to win, But then that's more a Labour thing, not unique to Jeremy Corbyn. Great ideas and the best policies, but meaningless because they never won. well, sadly so, because some of his ideas were great,
Well, that's the challenge of democracy is that you can have all sorts of ideas, but unless you actually win power, it's very difficult to do anything to actually change things. That's the dilemma, if you like, of democratic systems.
Yeah, there seemed to be a bit of a gap between his anti-EU kind of stance, or his supposed neutral stance on the EU, which turned out not to be very neutral, and then the outworkings of Brexit in terms of how it affects the poorest in our society. I thought there was a bit of a dichotomy there.
Well, there was a sort of a long-standing sort of left tradition that the European Union was a capitalist club that was established as part of the whole sort of Cold War thing, is in opposition to the Soviet Union and its satellites. And there was that sort of tendency that always existed, the sort of suspicion of a capitalist club. And the European Union became a lot more than that, in my view, and I was a very enthusiastic, and still remain a very enthusiastic supporter of the European Union for a whole lot of different reasons. And I was opposed to Brexit. But it is clear during that referendum in the UK that Corbyn really, his heart wasn't in actively opposing Brexit in the referendum, and he didn't play as active a role as he might have done. And it was a very close decision. Who knows if that might have made a difference? Who knows? Even that's water under the bridge, I think.
Like even post Brexit, when there was huge ructions going on under Theresa May, and there was opportunities there where he could have whipped the Labour Party to kind of soften Brexit, or to even potentially get another referendum on the cards, and he wasn't for having any of it. Perhaps for democratic reasons, or perhaps because of his own Euroscepticism.
Yeah, well, I'm sure there's all sorts of, there's a problem with sort of populist platforms that when they work because they're offering people lots of things that they like, but sometimes they can come crashing down because they lack credibility, or it's impossible to deliver the sort of things that are offered. And there has been, this is one of the features of the last, I suppose, 20 years, the rise of populist politics, largely of the right, but sometimes of the left, that aren't carried through in terms of actual real change. It makes a significant difference in the lives of people. But that's on to, I suppose, a much broader agenda.
Yeah, well, let me put a point to you, Tony. Populist politics doesn't work in a fair electoral system. For example, PR, like you take Germany, for example, pretty hard for a populist leader to come to power in Germany with the electoral system that they've got, because they've got, their tradition of and getting 2, 3, 4 months of negotiations before forming a government. I mean, after 3 or 4 months negotiating a program of government, pretty much all your radical populist policies are going to be kind of beaten into some sort of moderate plan for government. If you take the UK electoral system at Westminster, complete opposites. Like take for example 2005 general election, Tony Blair got, I think, 36% of the vote, and yet he had a 66 seat majority.
Sure. Yeah, no, the electoral system can make a difference, can make it easier or harder for particular sort of parties to rise and fall. I mean, we saw it, I can't remember the date, but an election in Canada where the Conservative Party might have been in government, but they totally collapsed to having like three MPs in the Canadian Parliament or something. And it was because of the electoral system. That's certainly true. At the same time, if you look at that period in European elections, there was a high degree of volatility. There was lots of very small parties that had been around for a while, sometimes were newly emerging, that got got high levels of support quite suddenly. Some of them also fell away quite quickly. Even in Germany, the sort of neo-Nazi the AfD, their support for them started to rise to scary levels. So populist messages, particularly anti-immigrant messages, were getting through in quite a few places in a way which is quite worrying, because it then, in some cases, was taken to legitimize quite brutal actions against some communities. So that, the populism was a problem. I think if you look at politics in the United States at the moment, I mean, it's scary what's happening there and where it's all likely to go, because you sort of look at the Republican Party, and it's hard to see any real commitment to genuine democratic norms anymore there.
Yeah.
The gerrymandering alone is frightening. Like, if you look at the electoral maps over there and what they were prior to, like, Republican lawmakers getting in within an individual state and then redrawing the boundaries, and it looks like an ink blot.
Yeah, but that's something we learned a long time ago in Northern Ireland. The last people you put in charge of drawing up the electoral boundaries are the people who are going to stand for election, because no matter how sort of pure of heart they are, there's always going to be a tendency to draw the boundaries in a way which will help them, and that's clearly what's happening in the United States. We sort of address that problem in Northern Ireland by having independent people looking at these things. I don't know whether that's ever going to be possible in the US, but yeah, that's a factor. And politics is dramatically polarized in the United States in a way which I think is going to be very challenging for the country in future years.
And they're in perpetual election cycles in the States. I mean, it's next year. Basically, the race for the White House starts again 18 months out. I mean, it's a ridiculously long campaign for a term that only lasts for 4 years, and then you've got your midterm in between.
And the amount of money involved as well, it becomes a toxic influence. Yeah. There was various decisions by the Supreme Court which made it easier for people to pour money into supporting particular campaigns, and that had a very toxic influence on the way some things were done. So yeah, I mean, it is actually very worrying looking at the US, just where things are going, because it's not a good model at all in terms of what might happen over future years.
I was talking to an American friend of mine, and he was saying that combination of Biden's spending plan, which he felt didn't adequately address the rise of the cost of living, which is coming, and it'll hit a lot of Americans hard, particularly with stats like 60% of Americans have less than $1,000 in their bank account. And that with the cost of living increases, it's going to wipe that out. And
well, one of the things that Biden tried to do at the start of his presidency was this massive investment in infrastructure, which was a sort of a classic Keynesian approach about using demand management by the state in order to build things or make things as a way of boosting the economy. I mean, ironically, whenever Trump was running for election, he promised to do largely the same thing. Never actually did it, but promised to do essentially the same thing. Biden's facing a situation now where if they lose control of Congress in the midterms, that's basically his presidency over. And the other big surprise of the first few years of the Biden presidency is that Kamala Harris hasn't made a bigger impact.
Yeah,
because that I don't know what has happened there, but something has gone wrong.
Yeah, like I do like Biden, but yeah, like there is an element of, like, somebody pointed out to me, it was kind of like a Weekend at Bernie's scenario. Like, the man is obviously when it comes to his speech, struggles to say the right words and mumbles his words and gets a bit confused at times. So it doesn't look great for him. There's zero chance of running in the next election. And the American friend I was talking to very recently was just in despair. He's just like, he's convinced Trump's going to get back in. Cost of living crisis will hit the Americans in the next 18 months, and that will be an absolute golden ticket for Trump support.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to read what's going to happen there. I mean, there's something. I remember years ago, I was in Chicago at a conference, and I met a couple of friends who worked with an educational organization, and they had been very strong supporters and allies of a young Illinois congressman called Barack Obama, and they were behind his campaign to try and sort of a run for the presidency. At that point, they thought it wasn't going to happen. Hillary Clinton was in too strong a position, and there was no way that he was going to be able to overcome that. And they were speculating on all sorts of plans, including the possibility that Al Gore might run with Obama as his running mate, so that 4 years later, Obama would be in a position with the experience of being vice president to run in his own right. And then, of course, 2 primaries happened, and the whole thing just turned on its head. So sometimes things can happen in the US to surprise us, but
the acorn became the oak before they expected it to.
well, the thing that was most remarkable, I'm sure you remember it, was he won the first primary unexpectedly, and then the second primary he lost, but he gave that speech with that phrase, "Yes, we can," and everyone thought he'd won because the speech was just so amazing, and it added to the momentum, and he went on obviously and did win. But so yes, politics can be a little bit unpredictable, but the commercialization of politics and the role of people who fund political parties is now potentially so toxic that it's very difficult to see any new face breaking through anytime quickly. But we'll see over the next couple of years.
Yeah.
Maybe something will emerge.
Well, Joe Biden's 80 this November, and you're a long way off that, Tony. So you must be feeling pretty good about how you're going to fill your days in the next decade or two. You must have a few ideas on how to keep yourself occupied after a long slog of a career so far.
Well, I consider myself really lucky to work in university because I get an opportunity to do work that I really enjoy, working with students, doing a bit of teaching, doing lots of research. And one of the advantages of doing research in a place like Northern Ireland is that it's small enough that it's actually possible to make a difference. Because politicians, civil servants, people in the various interest groups, and so it's possible to do research that does make a difference in things. And that's at the same time there will be a life beyond work. I play a bit of Irish music, I like photography, I read a lot of books, so I'm keeping myself busy doing all the things so that the point at which I retire from Queen's, I'll have plenty to keep myself busy.
And what do you think that'll involve, Tony?
Sorry?
What have you got in mind? What do you think that'll involve, Tony?
Oh, well, I mean, one of the things I started doing during lockdown was, because I played a bit of Irish music for years. I played a little bit, not very well, on the flute, and I've played the whistle for years. I've always wanted to play the concertina, but never had an opportunity. And during lockdown, I thought, let's just buy one and try it out. Yeah. And I've been taking classes up in the Glengormley School of Traditional Music, and they're great. We've got a great teacher. He's brilliant on the concertina. And so I've been trying to sort of play my way through that, and that's all good fun. And that's, it's important to have things outside work just to keep to keep a bit of variety in life.
I will, like Trump on the golf course, he's
yeah, well, I don't feel any need to fake it. I can just play as well as I can or not.
You wouldn't be kicking the ball up the fairway when no one's looking, Tony.
But we tape inside the concertina which plays the tune properly.
Just out of curiosity, we're talking about the American politics there. Is there any Democrats that have caught your eye you think could be a decent contender who, I'd say it's almost a certainty it's going to be Trump running, and he will get the Republican Party nomination?
I don't know, to be honest. I mean, I wouldn't say that I would know the American political scene well enough to try and spot people that are sort of emerging at the moment. I mean, the official position, I think, is that Biden is going to run, but you have to wonder whether that's actually a practical possibility. I suspect there was always a sort of a strong possibility that Kamala Harris might have been the candidate next time, but I'm not sure that looks like a strong runner at the moment. I'm sure there are people that are quietly working away behind the scenes trying to garner a bit of support and talking to people and trying to raise a bit of money and doing this. So at some stage in the not too distant future, some people will start to emerge, and we'll see what happens. The number of candidates that have run in the primaries for both parties over this last number of elections has been huge. We'll see what happens next time. I'm sure some people will emerge as possibilities, but that remains to be seen.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think it makes a great deal of importance whether Biden is alive for next election. Sure, SDLP have been running on a John Hume ticket now for 20 years.
Well, they've been running on a legacy, but my goodness, what a legacy that is. I do a lot of work with the Council of Europe. And one time when I was in Strasbourg, I took the tram out to the border with Germany just to walk out to the bridge that John Hume always talked about. And it is actually, you walk across the bridge, you see some memorials on the other side in Germany to some of the things that happened the last century. The European project really was and is quite an extraordinary thing. And I think John Hume spotted that. And that bridge for him symbolized what could be possible whenever you started to change traditional notions of sovereignty. And people often criticize him for having one speech, but that was some speech, and it made, in the long term, it made such a huge difference. But yeah, it goes back to the earlier point. I think the SDLP are in difficulties now, and they have to try and find some distinctive offer that otherwise they're in danger of just being squeezed even more into the future.
Yeah, any thoughts on what that offer could be?
Well, what's my own view, and I'm not a member of the SDLP or anything, but my own view is that a clear articulation of a social democratic position is probably the way to go. Now, who knows whether it would work or not if they were articulating a set of sort of detailed policies around a different type of future based on social democratic principles. And also, I think one of the things which has helped Alliance is to take a clear position on a series of social issues and take a more liberal position on social issues. And that, to be honest, is one of the challenges for the SDLP. You have people in there who do have a liberal position on social issues, but you also have people who have deeply conservative views on some social issues, and that's another thing that maybe didn't particularly help them during the last election.
Yeah, people thought that Angie were out there to steal Sinn Féin votes, but as it turned out, that's a lot came from the SDLP because they were older and more conservative socially.
Well, that's what people were saying
on issues like abortion and that.
Yeah. And I mean, this is one of the big sort of demographic changes in Northern Ireland. The post Good Friday generation, the young people for whom the Troubles are really history, that haven't had a direct experience of them. That generation, by and large, is much more open, much more socially liberal, much more committed to a sense of fairness and justice, and that's the direction of travel. I think part of the problem with rhetoric that seems to be too rooted in the prior period is that it's addressing issues that a lot of young people are not terribly motivated by.
Do you think there would have to be some significant economic forces to get a United Ireland across the line with the growth of the other category of people who are maybe a nationalist with a very small N or a unionist with a very small U, and just?
Well, yeah, a lot of people say, and I think there's some justification, is that with this sort of, if you like, trifurcation of politics, people who are clearly nationalists, people who are clearly unionist, and then this group in the middle. It's almost like a 40-40-20 society at the moment. That the side which wins the argument will be the side that can persuade the group in the middle. At the same time, any major change is more likely to be successful if you can generate a degree of consensus around it, and that involves recognizing, taking seriously, and trying to address some of the fears that other people have about radical change. I think that's a challenge for those who want to pursue a United Ireland. That I think just 50% plus one is a sort of the democratic way to do it. But in order to do it in a way which is peaceful, you need to, I think, to work harder towards a more consensual understanding of what that might be like, and address some of the fears that many people clearly have about that possibility.
Yeah, and do you think down south they're interested in like? Do you think their appetite for it is there for United Ireland down south?
Well, all the evidence at the moment is that not really. I think the opinion polls are suggesting majority support for it in the south, but the opinion polls seem to me also suggested it's not that high a priority, and that people haven't come to terms with the potential for the sort of changes that might be required if this actually to happen. Obviously, you get opinion polls in this situation. One thing, if you get to a point where there was actually a referendum, then that's a whole different ballgame, because you'll have lots of sort of arguments, debates, and you have a lot more stuff on the table, as it were. But people are always saying, and they're quite right, Brexit is a good example of absolutely the worst way to do a referendum, where no one was really quite sure what was going to happen, and all sorts of things, including lots of untruths, played part of the campaign. And so if the best way to make change like that is to work hard to ensure that by the point at which change becomes something that looks like it's going to happen, most people are already on board, or at least accepting of because they feel they can understand what's going to happen and aren't terrified by it. Well, it sort of we ranged quite widely over a whole lot of issues there, and I hope it wasn't too sort of all over the place for what you want to try and do with the...
No, it's great, and we just like talking about interesting things, so this was really good for me. Like, it's really interesting.
All over the place is our format.
Very good.
We ask our guests quite a standard set of questions that we like to ask all our guests. Kieran, do you remember them all?
Oh, the quick fire. I think I would be able to guess what Tony's might be in a couple of these. So voting for 16 plus, Tony, yes or no?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I thought you'd say that coming from a university. Favorite place to visit in Ireland?
In Ireland, I think probably Glendalough. I just find that place magical. Nice. I like Wicklow. Holiday a lot in Wicklow, so I like going to Wicklow, and Glendalough is a special place in Wicklow.
You've never been further south than your idea, man, is that
right? It's a foreign country. Do I need my passport, or what do I do?
No, Glendalough, good choice. Favorite thing that you're watching at the moment, Tony?
Or
recently?
Well, there are two TV series that I watch permanently. One is The West Wing, which for me is Leadership 101, and the other is The Wire, which I think is the greatest television series that has ever been made. It is Shakespearean in its scope and its approach. I do watch a lot of films. I like film noir films from the 1940s and 50s, and I have a huge collection of old black and white films, which I watch fairly constantly as well. The only other thing
you watch that when no one else is at home.
the two other things that I watch all the time: Channel 4 News, best news program on TV, and Serie A. I'm a big AC Milan fan. I've been following.
Are you? Oh, very good. That's the first time they've won it now since.
Well, they haven't won it just yet. There's one year to go, one game to go, so they haven't won it quite yet. But the fans are very excited at what's happening, and it's been quite a year.
Aye, Italian fans, like they know how to do it. Like they know how to back their team.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
No, well, thanks very much for joining us this evening, Tony. It's been great to have you on.
My pleasure, and thanks very much for inviting me.